Entire civilizations have melted back into the earth, leaving only whispers in stone. This is the profound mystery of history's great vanishings, where cultures disappeared without a trace. We will travel from the American Southwest to the jungles of Central America to uncover why sophisticated societies suddenly abandoned their cities. You will leave with a new understanding of the delicate threads that hold any civilization together. How did the Greenland Norse vanish after 400 years of survival? What caused the Maya to desert their magnificent pyramids? The stories of these lost worlds hold urgent lessons for our own. What does it truly take for a society to disappear forever? High on the sun-baked cliffs of Mesa Verde, silent stone cities perch like abandoned eagle nests. These are the cliff dwellings of the Ancestral Puebloans, a people you might know as the Anasazi. They were master architects and keen astronomers, building complex multi-story structures and aligning their ceremonies with the cosmos. Yet by the year 1300, these magnificent apartments were completely vacant. The archaeologist Stephen H. Lexon described their departure as a monumental, planned exodus from a homeland. They did not just leave a few villages, they walked away from an entire world they had built over centuries. So what drove them out? The answer is written in the trees. Tree ring data reveals a grim story, a prolonged and severe drought that gripped the region for decades. For a society dependent on maize agriculture, this was a catastrophe. Their carefully managed fields withered, and their stores of corn dwindled. But the environment may not have been the only pressure. There is evidence of rising conflict, with some settlements showing signs of violence and a trend towards building defensive positions high on the cliffs. Was it a combination of starvation and social unrest that finally broke the community apart? The silent testimony of these empty stone rooms suggests a people pushed to their limit, forced to make a heartbreaking choice. They did not vanish into thin air, but rather migrated, carrying their culture and knowledge to new homes. Their descendants are believed to be the people of the Hopi Mesas and the Zuni Pueblos. The story of the Anasazi is not one of a mysterious extinction, but a profound lesson in adaptation. It shows us that sometimes the greatest act of survival is knowing when to walk away from a home that can no longer support you. This delicate dance with a changing environment would be tested on an even grander scale, deep in the heart of the Maya world. Far to the east, another great city rose from the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi River. Cahokia was a marvel of the ancient world, a sprawling metropolis that, at its zenith around the year 1050, dwarfed the size of medieval London. Its heart was the colossal Monk's Mound, a towering earthen pyramid that required moving over 14 million baskets of soil, all by hand. From its summit, a powerful ruler could gaze upon a city teeming with tens of thousands of people, a bustling hub of artisans, traders, and priests. Grand plazas hosted ceremonial games, and a woodhenge of tall posts tracked the movements of the sun. This was the pinnacle of the Mississippian culture, a vibrant and complex society. Yet, just a few centuries later, this epicenter of power was completely silent. The great plazas were empty, the mounds abandoned to the elements. So what happened to the people who built this American metropolis? The city's own success may have sown the seeds of its decline. Such a dense population placed an immense strain on the local environment. Forests were cleared for building and fuel, and the once abundant game was hunted out. Then climate shifts began to disrupt the reliable growing seasons. A series of prolonged droughts would have crippled the maize agriculture that fed the massive city, leading to food shortages and famine. We can see the signs of a society under stress in the archaeological record. the city's central precinct was eventually encircled by a massive wooden palisade, a 2-mile-long wall of sharpened logs. This was not a symbol of unity, but a clear sign of rising fear, a defense against social unrest or external threats. The collapse was not a single, dramatic event. There was no invading army that sacked the city. Instead, Cahokia experienced a slow-motion dissolution. Over generations, people simply left. They drifted away from the crowded, struggling center, migrating out to form smaller, more sustainable villages along the river valleys. The great civilization did not vanish, it decentralized. Its people and their traditions dispersed, becoming the ancestors of later Native American nations. This story challenges our very idea of collapse. It asks us a difficult question. How does a society choose to dismantle its greatest achievements? The end of Cahokia was not an extinction, but a profound transformation, a strategic retreat from a way of life that was no longer viable. This theme of a society reorganizing itself in the face of overwhelming pressure finds its most dramatic expression in the jungles of Central America, where entire cities were reclaimed by the vines. Deep within the emerald jungles of Guatemala and Mexico, the stone temples of Tikal and Palenque stand as silent witnesses to one of history's most perplexing vanishings. The Maya of the classic period were at the height of their power, master mathematicians and astronomers who built sprawling cities and tracked celestial cycles with breathtaking precision. Then, around the 9th century, the southern lowlands grew quiet. The great stone stelae, which had recorded the deeds of kings for centuries, stopped being carved. The grand plazas, once bustling with life, were slowly reclaimed by the forest. This was not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow-motion crash, a gradual unraveling of a complex society. So what caused this brilliant civilization to walk away from its heartland? The answer is written in the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes. Sediment cores reveal a terrifying truth, a series of severe, multi-decade droughts that gripped the region. For a civilization dependent on seasonal rains to fill their reservoirs and nourish their crops, this was an existential threat. Imagine the desperation as water supplies dwindled and maize fields failed, year after punishing year. At the very same time, the political landscape turned increasingly violent. Monuments from this era are filled with depictions of war, showing captured and humiliated rulers. Once allied city-states turned on each other in a fierce competition for dwindling resources. The kings, who claimed a divine right to rule and to intercede with the gods for rain, were failing their people on both fronts. How could you maintain faith in a leader who could neither bring water nor provide security? This potent combination of environmental catastrophe and incessant warfare shattered the social contract. The populace did not simply die out. They made a conscious choice to leave. They voted with their feet, migrating north to the Yucatan Peninsula or into the highlands, where Maya culture would continue to flourish in a new form for centuries. The collapse of the classic Maya was not an extinction, but a dramatic reorganization, a testament to what happens when the very pillars of a society, its climate, its politics, and its core beliefs all begin to crumble at once. This story of a culture confronting its own limits in a harsh environment finds a chilling parallel far to the north, where a different group of settlers faced a disappearing act in a world of ice. On the stark shores of Greenland, a different kind of silence fell. For over 400 years, the Norse settlers clung to their European way of life, farming and raising livestock in a landscape that grew increasingly unforgiving. These were the descendants of Vikings, a people renowned for their resilience, yet by the mid-15th century, their 2 Greenland settlements were empty. How does a society that survived for centuries simply cease to exist? The answer lies not in a single disaster, but in a tragic refusal to change, as researcher Thomas H. McGovern's work reveals their world was closing in on them from all sides. The onset of the Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures, shortening the already brief growing season and making it harder to keep their cattle alive through the long, dark winters. At the same time, their vital trade links with Europe, which supplied essential iron and timber, grew infrequent and then stopped altogether, leaving them isolated and unable to repair their tools or ships. But the most poignant factor was their own cultural identity. The indigenous Inuit people thrived in this very environment, mastering the art of hunting seals and whales from kayaks. The Norse, however, saw themselves as farmers and Christians. They looked upon the Inuit as pagan outsiders and stubbornly refused to adopt their successful hunting techniques, even as their own food supplies dwindled. They continued to build churches in the European style while their own children may have gone hungry. This rigid adherence to their identity, this cultural inflexibility, became a fatal liability. The last written record we have is a marriage document from 1408. After that, only silence. Their fate forces us to ask a difficult question. How can the very traditions that define a people, the very pride that holds them together, become the chains that bind them to a failing path? The Greenland Norse did not vanish in a mysterious cataclysm. They starved and froze while refusing to learn from their neighbors, a stark lesson in the absolute necessity of adaptation. This theme of a people confronting an island's limits echoes across the Pacific, where an even more isolated society created a mystery in stone, only to see their world fall apart. The word Croatoan, carved into a post on a deserted island, is one of history's most haunting puzzles. Off the coast of what is now North Carolina, 115 English men, women, and children established the Roanoke colony in 1587. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies, his return delayed for 3 long years by war. When he finally made it back in 1590, the settlement was utterly empty. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, just the silent cabins and that single, enigmatic word. It was not a message of panic. The letters were carved with careful deliberation, a clue left for those who would come looking. The name referred to Croatoan Island, now known as Hatteras Island, and to the friendly Croatan people who lived there. This single word points toward a theory of assimilation, not annihilation. Recent archaeological digs on Hatteras have uncovered European artifacts mixed with native tools from that exact period. Items like a rapier hilt and pieces of English pottery that suggest a prolonged, peaceful coexistence. It is possible the colonists, facing starvation and isolation, made the rational choice to abandon their failing outpost and seek shelter with their neighbors. They did not vanish, they simply joined another society, their English identity slowly blending into a new world. Yet other theories persist. Did a conflict with a different, less friendly tribe lead to their demise? Could disease have swept through the small community? The truth is, we may never know for certain. The power of the Roanoke story lies in its ambiguity. It is a snapshot of a fragile culture in its first moments, a community that crossed an ocean only to be swallowed by the very land they sought to claim. Their story is a stark reminder of the precariousness of isolated settlements, a theme that finds its ultimate expression thousands of miles away, on the most remote inhabited island on Earth. Isolated in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, Easter Island is a monument to human ambition and its consequences. The iconic Moche statues, those brooding stone giants, stand with their backs to the sea, forever watching over a land that could no longer sustain the society that built them. For generations, the story of Rapa Nui was told as a simple, tragic morality play, a clear case of ecocide. It was said the people recklessly chopped down every last palm tree to move their massive statues, inviting their own doom. But the truth, as revealed by researchers like Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, is far more complex and unsettling. The island's deforestation was not solely an act of human folly. It was accelerated by a stowaway, the Polynesian rat, which devoured the seeds and saplings of the native palm forests, preventing them from ever growing back. This ecological domino effect was catastrophic. Without trees, the soil eroded, washing away the fertile ground needed for crops. Just as critically, the islanders lost the raw materials to build the large, ocean-going canoes that were their lifeline to the deep-sea fish that supplemented their diet. Trapped on their own island, the society began to fracture. The very belief system that empowered the chiefs to command the construction of the moe crumbled. Over time, the culture pivoted dramatically. The old order, centered on ancestor worship and statue building, gave way to a new and desperate religion, the Birdman cult, which focused on a harsh annual competition to secure resources. By the time European explorers arrived, the population was a fraction of its former size, locked in a struggle for survival. The Rapa Nui people did not vanish, but their world was irrevocably broken and remade. Their story forces us to ask, how does a society recover when its most fundamental practices become impossible? It is a stark lesson in how tightly our fates are woven into the environment we depend upon, a theme that resonates with another island culture, one that faced a similar isolation but forged a radically different destiny. Centuries before the Maya raised their first pyramids, the humid jungles of the Gulf Coast of Mexico were the cradle of a civilization so influential it would be called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. This was the world of the Olmec. They are most famous for the colossal stone heads they left behind, each one a portrait of a powerful ruler carved from a single block of basalt, their features stoic and imposing. But their legacy is far greater than these monumental sculptures. The Olmec pioneered the ceremonial city center, developed a complex calendar system, and perhaps most importantly, created the foundational concepts of kingship and divinity that would echo for 1,000 years. Then, around 400 years before the Common Era, their great centers of power, San Lorenzo and later La Venta, fell silent. The altars where rituals were performed were deliberately defaced and buried. The colossal heads, their most enduring symbols, were carefully laid to rest in long lines as if given a formal funeral. This was not the chaos of an invasion. It was the quiet, deliberate end of an era. So what happened to the people who started it all? The evidence points not to a sudden attack, but to a slow environmental strangulation. The rivers that were the lifeblood of their civilization, vital for transport and for irrigating their fields, began to silt up. This changing landscape would have crippled their agricultural base and disrupted the trade networks that fed their wealth and influence. At the same time, new powers were rising in the highlands of Oaxaca and in the Maya lowlands. These successor cultures, the Zapotec and the Maya, were in many ways the Olmec's own intellectual children. They absorbed Olmec ideas about the cosmos, their ball game, and their vision of the divine ruler, and then they refined them, building their own magnificent cities. The Olmec heartland, once the vibrant center of the world, was gradually marginalized. Some theories even suggest that the common people, burdened by the demands of their elite to move immense stones and build great earthworks, may have eventually risen up or simply drifted away to these new, rising centers. The Olmec did not vanish in a cloud of mystery, they dissolved. Their culture dispersed like seeds on the wind, taking root in new soil and blossoming into new forms. This forces us to reconsider what we mean by disappearance. How does a mother culture fade away? Its end is not an extinction, but a transformation so complete that its essence lives on in the very societies that eclipsed it. The civilization that followed would leave behind a different kind of puzzle, not colossal heads, but a script that has stubbornly guarded its secrets for over 1,000 years. While the Olmec legacy was absorbed by their successors, another foundational civilization met a far more enigmatic end. In the fertile plains of the Indus Valley, a society flourished that rivaled ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia in its scale and sophistication. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were marvels of urban planning, laid out in precise grids with the world's first known municipal drainage systems, channeling waste away from homes with an efficiency that would not be seen again for millennia. Their people, the Harappans, engaged in vast trade networks, and they developed a unique and complex script. Yet, by around 1900 years before the Common Era, this meticulously ordered world began to fade. The great cities were slowly depopulated, and the civilization's distinctive hallmarks, from its standardized weights to its written language, fell out of use. With their writing still undeciphered, their final story is told not in words, but in the silent evidence they left behind. For a long time, the leading theory pointed to a violent end, suggesting an invasion by nomadic Indo-Aryan peoples. But the archaeology does not support a dramatic conquest. There are no layers of ash from great fires, no mass graves filled with the victims of a sacking. Instead, the evidence points to a slower, more complex unraveling driven by the land itself. Modern research reveals that the very river that gave them life, the mighty Indus, began to change its course. Its tributaries shifted or dried up, devastating the agricultural heartland that fed the urban populations. Imagine the gradual crisis as the canals that irrigated their fields ran dry season after season. This was compounded by a larger shift in the global climate, a move towards greater aridity that turned once fertile lands into dust. How does a society respond when its entire economic and agricultural foundation is systematically dismantled by its own environment? The Harappan answer was not to fight a losing battle, but to adapt in the most fundamental way possible. They chose to walk away from urban life. The population did not die out. They simply migrated eastward toward the foothills of the Himalayas where rainfall was more reliable. The grand, centralized civilization underwent a process of deurbanization, breaking down into smaller, more localized village cultures. What causes a highly organized urban society to willingly return to a village-based life? The story of the Indus Valley suggests it is the ultimate act of pragmatism. When the costs of maintaining a complex city become too great, when the water fails and the trade routes wither, the most resilient choice may be to simplify, to disperse, and to survive in a new form. This silent, strategic retreat from grandeur presents a different kind of vanishing, one not of conquest or cataclysm, but of deliberate downsizing. It is a puzzle of environmental adaptation that finds a haunting parallel on the other side of the world, where another desert culture created immense geoglyphs only to disappear into the very sands they drew upon. The arid coast of Peru seems an unlikely place for a great civilization to flourish. Yet the Moche people mastered this desert landscape, carving intricate canals to channel water from the Andes and transforming barren valleys into fertile fields. They raised immense pyramids of sun-baked brick, their facades adorned with vivid murals depicting gods and rituals. Their artisans produced works of breathtaking skill, from delicate gold masks to ceramic portraits so lifelike they seemed to breathe. This was a society of profound order and spiritual power, a culture that thrived for over 600 years. Then, around 800 AD, their world came undone. The trigger was not an invader, but a familiar force turned monstrous, the climate pattern we now call El Niño. ice cores drilled from nearby mountain glaciers tell a story of climatic violence. A sudden, prolonged El Niño event unleashed torrential rains on the coastal hills, which had been stripped of vegetation by generations of farming. Catastrophic floods then poured down the valleys, scouring away the very irrigation canals that were the civilization's lifeblood. Can you picture the devastation? Mud brick compounds dissolved into slurry, fields were buried under gravel, and entire communities were washed away. Just as society was reeling from this deluge, the pendulum swung to the opposite extreme. The same climate shift plunged the region into a drought that stretched for 30 years. The rivers that fed their intricate canal systems dwindled to a trickle. How do you rebuild your agricultural heartland when the water simply vanishes? The archaeological record shows a society in its death throes. At sites like the Huaca de la Luna, researchers have found the bodies of young men who were beaten and left unburied in the streets, a stark departure from the Moche's normal, respectful funeral practices. Even more telling are the final, desperate ritual deposits. They began entombing their most precious objects, not in the tombs of elites, but in humble storage rooms, as if making one last, futile offering to gods who had stopped listening. When the rains failed and the floods destroyed their works, the authority of the priestly class who claimed to mediate with the gods of nature would have evaporated. Why would you follow a king who could no longer deliver water? The Moche political structure shattered, but their cultural legacy did not die. Their knowledge of metallurgy, their artistic styles, and their engineering prowess were carried forward, absorbed and refined by the great Chimu kingdom and later the Inca Empire. The Moche themselves likely dispersed into smaller, more resilient communities in the highlands. Their story is a powerful lesson in the fragility of social order. It demonstrates how a civilization can be brought to its knees not by a foreign army, but by nature's indifference and by the collapse of the fundamental beliefs that hold its people together. This theme of a culture confronting an overwhelming and unpredictable environment finds a different expression on the vast grasslands of North America, where a way of life centered on the bison suddenly faced its own end. The silence that fell over Moundville was not one of ruin, but of reorganization. On the banks of the Black Warrior River in Alabama, this great ceremonial center once pulsed with life, its grand plaza ringed by nearly 30 earthen mounds where a powerful elite presided over a vast chiefdom. It was the second great capital of the Mississippian world, a spiritual and political powerhouse, yet by the time Spanish explorers moved through the region in the 16th century, the heart of this civilization had grown quiet. The central power that once coordinated life across the valley had simply faded away. So what caused the rulers of Moundville to lose their grip? The answer may lie in an invisible enemy that traveled faster than any European conquistador. Old World diseases like smallpox and measles, for which the native population had no immunity, likely swept through the region decades before face-to-face contact. These pandemics would have been apocalyptic, devastating the population and, in doing so, severing the very bonds of society. How can a priestly class maintain its authority when its people are dying in droves and its prayers to the gods go unanswered? The foundation of their power, built on a claim to divine favor and the ability to mobilize labor for grand projects, would have crumbled into dust. It was not necessarily a violent overthrow, but a quiet, profound loss of faith. With the population decimated and social order unraveling, the complex system that supported the elite simply became unsustainable. People likely made a pragmatic choice to disperse, to return to a smaller scale, more resilient way of life in smaller villages. The great chiefdom fragmented into simpler, more manageable communities. This story forces us to ask a difficult question. What truly holds a complex society together? Is it the grand monuments and the power of kings, or is it the shared belief of the common people in that system? At Moundville, that belief appears to have evaporated under the strain of an unimaginable demographic catastrophe. The civilization did not vanish, it simply chose to shed its centralizing skin, transforming itself to survive. This pattern of a sophisticated culture fragmenting under external pressure finds a powerful echo far across the Atlantic, where a vibrant Bronze Age society faced a collapse so complete it became the stuff of legend. The world of the Mycenaean Greeks was a realm of warrior kings and imposing citadels. These were the people of the legendary Agamemnon, a civilization of sprawling palace complexes that acted as the economic and administrative hearts of their world. They commanded fleets, engaged in lavish trade across the Mediterranean, and recorded their wealth in a complex script known as Linear B. Then, around 1200 years before the Common Era, their entire world imploded. The great palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, and Turin were violently put to the torch and abandoned. What could possibly bring down such a powerful and organized society so completely? The answer lies not in a single enemy, but in a perfect storm of catastrophes that fed upon each other. Historians point to a mysterious coalition of raiders known only as the Sea Peoples, who ravaged coastal cities across the eastern Mediterranean. Were these invaders the cause of the collapse, or were they a symptom of a wider chaos? At the same time, the Earth itself seemed to revolt. Evidence suggests a period of significant seismic activity, with earthquakes damaging the very fortifications meant to keep enemies out. This physical destruction coincided with a catastrophic breakdown in the international trade networks that were the lifeblood of the Mycenaean elite. The flow of tin and copper, essential for making bronze weapons and tools, was severed. How do you maintain an army or a complex economy when your supply chains disintegrate? It is easy to imagine a society buckling under these combined pressures. The central authority of the Wanax, the Mycenaean king, would have evaporated as he failed to provide security or prosperity. Famines likely sparked internal rebellions as a desperate populace turned on a ruling class that could no longer protect them. The result was a civilizational blackout. The knowledge of Linear B writing was utterly lost, and Greece plunged into a dark age where population levels fell dramatically, and life reverted to a simpler, more isolated village existence. This was not a total extinction of the Greek people, but a dramatic cultural regression. The sophisticated palace economy shattered into small, tribal communities. Yet, from this fragmented world, the seeds of classical Greece would eventually sprout. The Mycenaean collapse forces us to confront a terrifying reality. How fragile are the complex systems that hold our own world together? It demonstrates that a civilization is not felled by one blow, but by a cascade of failures where broken trade, natural disaster, and social unrest combine to create an unrecoverable crisis. This theme of an interconnected society unraveling finds a stark and lonely parallel thousands of miles away, where a powerful empire simply evaporated into the sands of Central Asia. South of the Pharaohs, along the fertile Nile, the Kingdom of Kush forged an empire in the sun. For centuries, its capital at Meroe was a powerhouse of trade and industry, a city so formidable it once conquered Egypt itself, ruling as the mighty 25th dynasty. Its rulers were buried beneath sharp, desert pyramids, and its ironworkers fueled an economic engine that lit up the region. Yet by the 4th century, this great capital was fading into silence. How does a state that once commanded an empire simply recede from history? The unraveling of Kush reveals a slow, relentless squeeze. The land around Meroe was being bled dry. Centuries of intensive cattle herding had overgrazed the pastures, while the voracious demand for charcoal to smelt iron denuded the forests that held the soil in place. Without those trees, the desert began to advance, turning marginal lands barren and squeezing the agricultural base that supported the urban elite. At the very same time, their economic lifelines were being cut. A new power was rising to the southeast, the Axumite kingdom in the highlands of modern Ethiopia. With its strategic port at Adulis, Axum began to dominate the lucrative trade routes of the Red Sea, routes that had once funneled wealth directly to Mara. The kingdom was caught in a vise, its environment failing from within while its commerce was stolen from without. Then came the pressure from nomadic groups, people known as the Noba, moving in from the south and west. There is little evidence of a single, devastating invasion, but rather a steady, encroaching presence that further strained the kingdom's weakened defenses and resources. The end of Mara was not a dramatic sacking, it was a gradual loss of cohesion. The central authority in the capital could no longer command the countryside, provide economic security, or hold back the desert. The great state fragmented, its culture and people reorganizing into smaller, more resilient Nubian kingdoms like Nobatia and Makuria. The story of Kush is a masterclass in the slow death of a civilization. It asks us what happens when the pillars of power, fertile land, thriving trade, and secure borders all begin to crumble at once. A dominant power can fade not with a bang, but with a weary sigh, its people adapting to a new, quieter reality. This pattern of a society succumbing to environmental and economic pressures would be repeated in a much more isolated theater, on the wind-swept volcanic islands far out in the Atlantic. Far out in the Atlantic, on the volcanic islands the Spanish would name the Canaries, the Guanche people had carved out a life in profound isolation. For over 1,000 years, they developed a unique culture, a society of Berber origin that was a living relic of the Stone Age. They mummified their dead, lived in caves and simple stone houses, and worshipped gods of the sun and sky. Their world was about to be shattered by an external force unlike any they had ever known. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors in the 15th century was not a slow environmental pressure or a gradual decline. It was a swift and brutal collision of worlds. The Guanches had no immunity to the Old World diseases the Spaniards carried, and waves of smallpox and measles decimated their population. Their stone tools and wooden weapons were utterly useless against European steel, horses, and firearms. This was not a mystery born of environmental change or internal strife. It was a deliberate and systematic destruction. The Guanches were killed in battle, enslaved, and forcibly assimilated into the new colonial order. Their language was forbidden, their religious sites were destroyed, and their social structures were dismantled. While their genetic legacy lives on in the modern people of the Canary Islands, their culture, their worldview, their very identity was systematically erased. What is the final fate of a culture that encounters a technologically superior and expansionist power? The Guanche story provides the grim, unambiguous answer. It represents a different kind of vanishing altogether, one not of adaptation or transformation, but of outright cultural extinction. This tragedy of colonial conquest forces us to confront a difficult truth. Some disappearances are not puzzles to be solved, but historical wounds that never fully heal. They stand as stark reminders of the fragile beauty of human diversity and how quickly it can be lost to the tides of conquest. This deliberate erasure of a people's identity leads us back to the Mediterranean, to a civilization whose own sudden collapse was so total it inspired the legend of a lost continent. The labyrinthine palace of Knossos, with its vivid frescoes of leaping dolphins and graceful athletes, stands as a monument to the Minoans, a people who forged Europe's first great civilization. Their world was a marvel of sophistication and peace, a maritime empire that thrived for centuries without fortifications. Then, around 1600 years before the Common Era, a cataclysm erupted just 70 miles to the north. The volcano on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, detonated with a force that may have been greater than the eruption of Krakatoa. The event itself did not instantly wipe out Crete. Instead, it unleashed a cascade of consequences. How does a civilization recover when the sea itself turns against it? Colossal tsunamis, towering waves generated by the collapse of the volcanic cone, would have slammed into the northern coast of Crete, obliterating the Minoan fleet and sweeping away their vital harbor towns. This was not just a flood, it was an economic and military catastrophe that destroyed their navy, the very source of their trading wealth and power. Then came the ash. A thick blanket of volcanic pumice and dust fell across the island, smothering fields and poisoning the soil. For years, the sun would have been dimmed, leading to failed harvests and famine. The Minoan society, already reeling from the destruction of its coastal infrastructure, was pushed to the brink. In this moment of profound weakness, a new power saw its opportunity. The Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, a more warlike and fortified culture, moved in. This was likely not a single dramatic invasion, but a gradual takeover, a filling of the power vacuum left by a crippled and starving population. The Minoans did not vanish into thin air. Their culture was absorbed, their identity rewritten by the newcomers. The mysterious Minoan script Linear A, which remains undeciphered to this day, was abandoned. In the palace archives, archaeologists find it replaced by Linear B, an early form of Greek used by the Mycenaean administrators. Even the art changes, the vibrant, naturalistic scenes of Minoan life giving way to the more rigid, warlike imagery of Mycenaean lords and chariots. This is a disappearance through assimilation. The brilliant, unique thread of Minoan culture was not cut, but woven into a new, different tapestry. Their story forces us to reconsider the aftermath of disaster. What happens after the earthquake stops and the floodwaters recede? The true end of a culture can begin there, in the quiet, opportunistic conquest that follows nature's fury. This theme of a society being reshaped in the turbulent wake of a cataclysm finds a powerful echo across the Atlantic, where a vibrant and complex culture faced its own earth-shattering event. 13,000 years ago, a continent teeming with giants was crossed by a people armed with stone and ingenuity. Across North America, the Clovis culture left its calling card, a uniquely fluted spear point so effective and widespread it appears from coast to coast. These were the ultimate specialists, hunters whose lives were intricately tied to the pursuit of mammoths, mastodons, and other megafauna. Then, in a geological blink of an eye, both the hunters and their colossal prey were gone. For decades, the story seemed straightforward, a classic tale of overhunting. The overkill hypothesis painted a picture of relentless human pursuit, where these efficient hunters, facing animals with no innate fear of this new, two-legged predator, drove entire species to extinction. It was a compelling narrative of a people who, in their very success, sowed the seeds of their own downfall. But what if the truth is written not just in the bones of their prey, but in the very soil of that ancient world? A newer, more dramatic theory points to the sky. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a catastrophe, a comet that fragmented and exploded in the atmosphere above the ice sheets. The result was not a single crater, but a continent-scorching series of airbursts, triggering wildfires on a continental scale. The soot and dust thrown into the atmosphere would have blotted out the sun, plunging the region into a sudden, brutal cold snap called the Younger Dryas. In this scenario, the Clovis people were not the architects of their own demise, but victims of a cosmic bad luck. Their entire world, a lush ecosystem of giant beasts and open parklands, collapsed beneath their feet. How does a culture survive when its primary food source vanishes almost overnight and its environment is thrown into a deep freeze? The answer is that it does not survive in its old form. The archaeological record shows that the classic fluted Clovis point disappears from the record, but the people did not vanish, they adapted. Faced with a world of smaller game like deer and rabbits, and a new patchwork landscape of forests and plains, they stopped making the specialized mammoth hunting tools. Their culture fractured and evolved, branching out into the myriad regional traditions that archaeologists call the archaic. They became more generalized, more local, mastering the resources of specific river valleys and mountain ranges. The story of the Clovis is not one of a mysterious extinction, but of a forced and rapid evolution. It asks us a profound question about the nature of human resilience. What is the breaking point for a society built on a single grand purpose? When the mammoths disappeared, the Clovis way of life had to disappear with them, transforming into something new, more diverse, and ultimately more resilient. This theme of a culture fragmenting and adapting in the face of a lost world finds a haunting parallel on a remote Pacific island, where another society would face an ecological catastrophe entirely of its own making. Their legacy is written in the waves and the clay. Across thousands of miles of open ocean, the Lapita people performed one of humanity's most daring acts of exploration. Sailing in outrigger canoes, they pushed ever eastward from the islands of Southeast Asia, discovering and settling remote archipelagos no human had ever seen. Their calling card is a beautiful, intricate pottery, stamped with geometric designs and often tinged with a distinctive reddish hue. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 1600 to 500 years before the Common Era, their settlements dotted the islands from the Bismarck Archipelago all the way to Samoa and Tonga. They were the true pioneers of the Pacific, the direct ancestors of the Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian peoples. Yet, if you look for their signature pottery on the easternmost islands they reached, you find only silence. The vibrant potsherds vanish from the archaeological record. So what happened to this foundational culture? Their disappearance is perhaps the most positive story of vanishing in all of human history. It was not a collapse but a spectacularly successful transformation. As their descendants settled new islands, they adapted to new environments and new social realities. On some islands, the specific clay sources needed for their pottery may have been unavailable. But more profoundly, their culture was diversifying. The shared Lapita identity, symbolized by that pottery, began to branch out. The need for that particular artistic tradition faded as new artistic forms, new social structures, and new expressions of identity emerged from the unique conditions of each island group. The Lapita did not vanish, they evolved. Their story redefines what it means for a culture to disappear. How does a pioneering culture become its own descendants? It is a process of creative fragmentation, where a single, powerful rootstock gives rise to an entire forest of distinct but related societies. This is a vanishing that signifies not an end, but a magnificent new beginning. This creative dissolution stands in stark contrast to our final case, a disappearance that remains one of history's most enduring and absolute silences. High on the Ethiopian plateau, the Kingdom of Axum once minted its own gold coins and commanded the trade routes between the Roman world and the Indian Ocean. This was a powerhouse that built towering stone obelisks and embraced Christianity centuries before much of Europe. Yet its decline, beginning in the 7th century, was not a dramatic fall but a slow, quiet fading. The world simply began to trade around it. the rapid expansion of the Islamic caliphates in the Middle East and North Africa fundamentally rerouted global commerce. Caravans that once funneled goods to Axum's Red Sea port of Adulis now traveled new overland routes through Baghdad and Cairo, bypassing the kingdom entirely. How does a civilization cope when its primary source of wealth and influence, its very connection to the wider world, is suddenly severed? Axum was left in an economic backwater, its coins no longer needed in international markets. At the same time, the land itself was growing weary. Centuries of intensive agriculture to support a dense population had stripped the hillsides of their forests, leading to severe soil erosion. The very foundation of their prosperity was literally washing away. The combination was devastating. A shrinking economy could no longer sustain the grand urban centers, and the political heart of the kingdom shifted southward, seeking new, more fertile grounds. The great stone palaces of Axum were gradually abandoned, not to invaders but to silence and the encroaching soil. Yet here the story diverges from a simple collapse. The people, their language, and their Christian faith did not disappear. They reorganized, moving their center of gravity and evolving over centuries into the medieval Ethiopian Empire. Axum's legacy was not erased but transformed. Its story forces us to ask a critical question. What is the true measure of a civilization's end? Is it the abandonment of its cities or the persistence of its culture in a new form? Axum demonstrates that a great power can fade from the world stage not through conquest, but through economic isolation and environmental strain, a quiet unmaking that reshapes a world without destroying it. In the blistering silence of the Taklamakan Desert, a tomb of sand and salt held a secret for 4,000 years. The faces that emerged were startling, with long noses, red and blonde hair, and features that looked distinctly European. These were the Tarim mummies, the silent testimony of the Tocharians, a lost Indo-European culture that thrived in oasis cities along the ancient Silk Road. They were not just traders, but a sophisticated people with their own unique language, a tongue preserved on ancient manuscripts that scholars would later identify as Tocharian. Their culture was a vibrant strand in the rich tapestry of Central Asia, a world of bustling caravanserais and fertile green islands in a sea of sand. Yet by the 9th century, their distinct voice began to fade from history. How does an entire language, an entire identity, simply dissolve? The answer is not found in war or plague, but in the slow, powerful currents of cultural integration. The eastward expansion of the Igha Cogonate brought new peoples, new power structures, and a new lingua franca, Turkic languages that gradually supplanted Tocharian in the markets and the halls of power. Later, the Mongol invasions further churned the region's ethnic and linguistic landscape. The Tocharians were not exterminated, they were enveloped. Their people intermarried, their children grew up speaking the new dominant tongues, and their unique cultural identity was woven into the broader fabric of Central Asian life, losing its distinct outline in the process. This is a vanishing of a different kind, a quiet absorption into the mainstream. It forces us to ask, how does a culture choose or find itself compelled to trade its uniqueness for belonging in a larger world? This story of a people whose identity was reshaped by the tides of migration finds a powerful parallel far across the world, where a mound-building culture in North America experienced its own quiet transformation. Across the fertile valleys of the American Midwest, a different kind of civilization flourished, one built not on empire but on exchange. The Hopewell culture created a remarkable network spanning from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, a vast interaction sphere bound by shared ritual and the flow of extraordinary goods. They were not a unified kingdom with a single ruler. but a constellation of communities who came together to build breathtaking geometric earthworks, great circles and octagons that transformed the landscape into a sacred geometry. Their artisans worked with materials gathered from the ends of their known world, crafting intricate objects from obsidian from Wyoming, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, and shells from the Gulf Coast. This was a religious and social phenomenon of immense scale, a connective tissue linking diverse peoples for centuries. Then, around 500 AD, the flow of these exotic materials slowed to a trickle, and the construction of the great earthworks ceased. What could cause such a vibrant network to simply fall silent? The climate itself may have begun to shift, altering the patterns of rivers and the growth of plants that facilitated the long-distance journeys of traders. Perhaps the very routes that carried the sacred goods became disrupted, making the grand gatherings and shared projects impossible to sustain. At the same time, new ideas were emerging. There are hints in the archaeological record of a social transformation, a move away from the shared, cooperative religious model towards more localized and hierarchical power structures. The old ways of the Hopewell, centered on collective ceremony and the prestige of giving away wealth, may have been eclipsed by a new order where power was consolidated and passed down through hereditary chiefs, foreshadowing the rise of the Mississippian culture with its powerful, centralized rulers. The people did not vanish. Their descendants likely integrated into the societies that would become the historic tribes of the region, such as the Shawnee or the Miami. The end of the Hopewell was not a collapse of people, but the dissolution of a particular way of connecting. How does a widespread culture choose to stop building together? It is the quiet end of an era of collaboration, a reminder that the most intricate networks can unravel when the shared purpose that binds them fades away. This theme of a great connected realm succumbing to a changing world finds a stunning parallel in Southeast Asia, where an empire of stone and water faced its own moment of reckoning. The stone faces of Angkor Wat gaze serenely over a landscape of fallen towers and strangling roots. For 6 centuries, the Khmer Empire was the undisputed master of Southeast Asia, its capital a metropolis larger than any in medieval Europe, sustained by a hydraulic miracle. A vast network of canals, reservoirs, and intricate moats captured the monsoon rains, turning the seasonal deluge into a year-round engine of rice production. This system allowed Angkor to support a population of perhaps 750,000 people. Yet by the 1400s, this magnificent heart of an empire had been largely abandoned, its grand processional ways silent. How could a civilization so advanced simply walk away from its crowning glory? The answer is written in the mud. Sediment cores drilled from the city's great reservoirs or barrays reveal a story of systemic failure. The very canals that gave life to the empire began to choke on their own success. Deforestation in the surrounding hills led to catastrophic erosion, washing immense quantities of silt into the waterways. This relentless siltation, combined with a series of intense monsoon seasons that caused devastating floods, would have overwhelmed the delicate hydraulic balance. The intricate plumbing of the city clogged, and the rice paddies that fed the masses were either buried under sediment or washed away. The empire's agricultural foundation was crumbling. This environmental crisis unfolded just as powerful external pressures mounted. Rival Siamese kingdoms to the west grew increasingly assertive, launching repeated raids that stretched the Khmer military to its limits. Maintaining the sprawling, vulnerable city of Angkor became a strategic liability. At the same time, a profound spiritual shift was reshaping society. The state religion, which had once centered on a god-king who required immense temples and a vast priestly class, was being gradually supplanted by the Theravada Buddhism. This new faith was more personal and less dependent on grandiose royal projects. It did not need a massive, centralized infrastructure to sustain its spiritual authority. Why would a population continue to toil for a divine king when their new spiritual path offered enlightenment without his intercession? The abandonment of Angkor was not a chaotic flight. It was a calculated, strategic relocation of the political capital south to the area of Phnom Penh, a move that placed it nearer the burgeoning maritime trade routes of the Mekong Delta and farther from Siamese attacks. The Khmer Empire did not collapse in a single, dramatic event. It transformed, opting for a more sustainable and defensible model of power. This decision forces us to reconsider the very definition of a civilization's end. How does a society choose to leave its greatest monument behind? The story of Angkor is one of breathtaking pragmatism, a conscious choice to trade stone and ritual for survival and a new future. The sun-bleached stones of Tiwanaku stand as a ghostly echo of an empire that mastered the high Andes. On the shores of Lake Titicaca, this pre-Incan power forged a civilization in a seemingly impossible place, over 12,000 feet above sea level. They were architectural geniuses, cutting and fitting immense stone blocks with a precision that defies explanation, but their true mastery was agricultural. They transformed the marshy fringes of the lake into a miracle of productivity with their system of raised fields, known as suka collas. These were not simple garden plots, but vast, elevated platforms surrounded by canals. The water in these canals absorbed the intense daytime heat, releasing it slowly throughout the frigid Andean nights to create a protective thermal blanket around the crops, preventing frost. It was a perfect, self-sustaining system that yielded abundant harvests of potatoes and quinoa, feeding a populous capital and fueling their expansive influence. Then the rain stopped. A drought, not of years but of centuries, took hold of the Altiplano. The lake level began a slow, inexorable retreat, dropping far from the intricate network of canals that gave the raised fields their life. How do you farm with water when the water itself is vanishing? The carefully managed wetlands began to dry out and the protective microclimates collapsed. The empire's entire agricultural foundation, a marvel of human ingenuity, was rendered utterly useless by a climatic shift it could not control. This environmental catastrophe did not just cause famine, it shattered the social order. The authority of the Tiwanaku state, likely rooted in its ability to manage this complex agricultural system and distribute its bounty, evaporated along with the lake water. The evidence points to a society fracturing from within. The grand capital was gradually abandoned, and the unified culture broke apart into smaller, competing Aymara kingdoms. The Tiwanaku people did not vanish, they reorganized, their cultural legacy living on in these successor states. Their story forces a haunting question. What happens when the very technology that allows a society to flourish suddenly becomes its greatest vulnerability? The Tiwanaku Empire was a masterpiece of adaptation, but it was an adaptation to a specific, stable climate. When that climate changed beyond a certain point, their brilliant system became a trap. This profound vulnerability to a shifting environment is a thread that connects empires across the globe, leading us to a culture that faced a similar reckoning in the deserts of the American Southwest. 5,000 years before the first pyramids rose in Egypt, a different kind of metropolis was taking shape in the forests of Eastern Europe. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture constructed vast, sprawling settlements, some housing over 10,000 people, making them the largest communities on Earth in their time. Yet the most astonishing part of their story is not how they built, but how they chose to destroy. Every 60 or 80 years, they would deliberately set their entire towns ablaze, a ritual of fiery renewal that saw them rebuild from the ashes again and again for over 1,000 years. Why would a society commit to such a cycle of creation and destruction? The layers of burned clay and ash that mark their sites suggest a profound spiritual practice, perhaps a way of purifying the community, of severing ties with the past to make way for a new generation, or of offering their homes back to the earth. This was not a disappearance, but a scheduled, ceremonial vanishing woven into the very fabric of their existence. It was a way of life that proved incredibly resilient until a new force arrived from the steppes. Around 3,500 years before the Common Era, the culture's distinct footprint begins to fade from the archaeological record. This final vanishing was not a ritual fire, but a quiet assimilation. They were gradually absorbed by the incoming Yamnaya peoples, pastoralists from the eastern steppes who brought with them revolutionary new technologies like wheeled carts and a mobile, horse-based lifestyle. The old, settled, farming world of the Cucuteni-Trypillia was slowly enveloped by this new, dynamic culture. Their story challenges our idea of a singular, tragic end. How does a culture choose to stop rebuilding? Their final assimilation was not a violent conquest, but part of a vast, slow-moving demographic shift that reshaped the face of Europe. It marked the quiet closing of a unique Neolithic chapter, a world where houses were made to burn, and where the end of a home was always the beginning of a new one. For 2,000 years, the Dorset people were the undisputed masters of the high Arctic. Their world was one of ice and twilight, and they were exquisitely specialized for its demands, hunting seals and walrus through breathing holes in the frozen sea. They crafted elegant, delicate tools from bone and antler, and their small, isolated communities were perfectly tuned to the rhythm of the seasons. Then, around the year 1000, the archaeological record goes silent. Their distinctive artifacts vanish, their campsites are abandoned, and a profound quiet falls over their territory. This disappearance coincides almost perfectly with the arrival of a new people, the Thule, the direct ancestors of the modern Inuit. The Thule were not just another group of Arctic hunters, they were technological revolutionaries. They possessed large, open-skin boats called umiaks capable of hunting the great bowhead whales, and they had teams of powerful dogs to pull their sleds across vast distances. This was not a simple upgrade, it was a complete reimagining of life in the north. The Thule possessed a versatile toolkit that allowed them to exploit a wider range of resources, from the massive whales in open water to the caribou on the land. How does a culture that survived for 2 millennia suddenly find itself obsolete in its own home? The evidence points not to a war of extermination, but to a quiet, relentless squeeze. The Dorset, for all their brilliance, were specialists in a world that was suddenly changing. Their survival depended on stable sea ice and the seals that lived beneath it. A slight warming trend, or the arrival of a people who could hunt more efficiently and across a broader territory, would have placed immense pressure on the Dorset way of life. They may have been gradually outcompeted for the very seals and walrus that were their lifeblood. There is also the haunting possibility of introduced disease, as the Thule expanded from the west, bringing with them sicknesses to which the isolated Dorset had no immunity. Their highly refined adaptation, their greatest strength for centuries, became their ultimate vulnerability. The story of the Dorset is a stark lesson in the perils of overspecialization. It asks us what happens when a new way of life arrives that is simply more efficient, more connected, and more resilient. Sometimes the most profound vanishings occur not with a bang, but with the quiet, heartbreaking sound of a culture being gently but decisively replaced. The silent, 5-story structure of Montezuma Castle, nestled high in a limestone cliff in Arizona, is a testament to a people who knew when to move on. These were the Sinagua, a name that means without water in Spanish, given to them for their remarkable ability to thrive in that arid land. They were skilled farmers and traders, and for centuries their world was shaped by a dramatic event, the eruption of Sunset Crater around the year 1085. At first, the volcanic ash that blanketed the region was a blessing, a layer of mineral-rich fertilizer that improved water retention and boosted crop yields for generations. But such a gift from the earth is often a loan, not a grant. Over time, the nutrients in that same soil were gradually exhausted. Then came the true test, a great drought that gripped the entire Southwest in the 1400s. For a society living on the edge of a desert, a prolonged dry period was not an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. How do you decide to abandon the cliff dwellings your ancestors built with such care? The answer lies in a network of trails and trade routes the Sinagua had maintained for centuries. They were not isolated, they were connected. They knew of the thriving Pueblo communities to the north and east, peoples like the Hopi who shared similar beliefs and ways of life. Faced with a failing environment, the Sinagua made a conscious collective choice. They did not vanish, they migrated, following those ancient trails to new homes where they were absorbed into the larger Pueblo communities. Their distinct identity slowly blended into the cultural fabric of their hosts, but their legacy lived on. This exodus was not a failure, but a profound and successful strategy for survival. It asks us a difficult question: what does it truly mean to lose a culture if its people and their knowledge endure in a new form? The stone walls of Great Zimbabwe curve against the African sky, a labyrinth of granite that once echoed with the footsteps of kings. This was the heart of a vast trading empire, a kingdom built on gold. From the 13th to the 15th centuries, the Shona rulers here commanded a network that stretched from the interior mines all the way to the Swahili coast, where their precious metal was exchanged for Chinese porcelain and Persian glass. The city was a marvel of wealth and organization, its very name meaning Great House of Stone. Yet by the middle of the 15th century, the royal court had departed, leaving the magnificent stone enclosures to the elements. So why would a successful empire willingly abandon its capital? The answer is written in the land itself. A city of perhaps 20,000 people consumes a staggering amount of resources. Generations of intensive farming exhausted the once fertile soils surrounding the city, while the demand for timber for building and for fueling the smelting of gold denuded the local forests. The immediate environment could no longer support the dense population and the industrial activity that was the source of its wealth. How do you maintain a royal capital when the land itself is giving out? The rulers of Great Zimbabwe made a pragmatic and decisive choice. They did not wait for a crisis to overwhelm them. Archaeological and oral historical evidence suggests that the political elite simply moved their center of power north to the Zambezi Valley, where a new kingdom was rising, the Mutapa state. This new territory offered fresh, fertile lands and, just as importantly, access to newly discovered and even richer gold fields. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe was not a collapse. It was a strategic relocation, a calculated shift of the kingdom's center of gravity to ensure its continued prosperity. The culture, the people, and the royal lineage did not vanish. They simply transferred their capital to a more advantageous location, proving that the greatest act of leadership can sometimes be knowing when to move on from a magnificent past to secure a viable future. From the silent mounds of Cahokia to the empty plazas of Anchor, the stories of these vanished cultures form a haunting mosaic of human history. We have seen that disappearance is rarely a simple event, but a complex process of environmental change, social conflict, economic shifts, and sometimes a tragic failure to adapt. These narratives are not just tales of loss, they are profound lessons in resilience, transformation, and the delicate balance between civilization and its environment. They remind us that no society, no matter how grand or seemingly permanent, is immune to the forces of change. The Greenland Norse held fast to their identity until it became a cage. The Maya and the Moche saw their political authority dissolve when their gods failed to bring rain. The people of Cahokia and the Indus Valley made the conscious choice to walk away from urban grandeur, trading complexity for survival. As we face our own global challenges today, from climate instability to resource management, the echoes of these lost worlds urge us to listen. They ask us what we are holding onto too tightly and what we must be willing to change. The greatest legacy of these cultures may not be the ruins they left behind, but the questions they force us to ask about our own world. Let their stories inspire reflection on the legacy we wish to leave for the future. Thank you for joining this exploration into history's great vanishings. If these mysteries captivated you, please subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history, and share your thoughts on which disappearance you find most compelling in the comments below.